In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Yesterday was the feast of Saint Demetrios, the patron saint of Thessaloniki, one of the great and most venerated saints in our church, especially in Thessaloniki where I was. And yesterday, while we were celebrating the feast, I couldn't help remember the first year we were in Thessaloniki for the feast. I was still a layman, and we went to the center where the church is, and it's an enormous church, maybe the second largest church in Greece, and also the oldest. The current structures dates to 450. And anyway, we go down to the service, and there were so many people in the church. And this is an enormous church. I think there were at least 10,000 people in the church. And there were buses and buses and buses coming from as far as Russia. They had driven 3 days to come to this feast. And just bus after bus was unloading people, 50 more people, 50 more people, cramming into this church. And I remember at the height of the service, I was in there, and I literally could not make the sign of the cross because I was so pressed in. It was like a sardine. I could not raise my arm. At one point, I actually wondered if my feet were even on the floor, or if I was being suspended by being pressed together by so many people. That many people crushing into this place in order to be near the feast and to be near the saint. And then I read, not long after that, I was reading a homily by St. John Chrysostom. So we're talking about the late 4th century. And in it, he's chastising the people in the church because he says, last week we had a stampede inside the church, and 5 people were crushed to death on the way to venerate a saint's relics. And so he's angry with them and saying, this is not going to happen again. So this gives you an idea of the kind of Eastern model of personal space, right? I remember the first time when I came back to America in 2016, and I came out for communion, and I was so used to being rushed. When you come out for communion, there's like a mob attacks. And here in America, everyone comes out neatly or dismissed according to their row. And I was wondering, where is everybody? Why aren't they coming? Because they're so used to this mob coming, right? This is the kind of Eastern mentality even to this day. And it traces back not only through Chrysostom in the late 4th century, but to the time of Jesus. This is the Eastern mentality, that if there's something holy, if there's something that I want to be a part of, I better get in there. I don't wait for someone to invite me. I better get in there. And so there's this crowding around. And today, in the gospel, we can kind of picture this scene. I think we read it a little lightly as Westerners because we tend to assume our own kind of context, right? But it wouldn't have been like that at all. When it says here that at that time Jesus was there, a man named Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, comes and asks him. He comes down and bows down in front of him and asks to heal his daughter. And as Jesus is going, there's this mob following Jesus wherever he goes because people want to be near him. And it says in the text, as he went, so as he's going to heal this man's daughter, as he went, the people pressed around him. And the Greek word is sympnigo, which literally means, pnigo is to suffocate, and sympnigo to be suffocated about by other people. It's the same word he used a few chapters earlier when we discussed the parable of the sower and the weeds that are coming up around the flower that choke out the flower, sympnigo. They choke him out. So it's the people were pressed around him like this. Imagine this scene of people just packed that you can't move. He would need 12 disciples just to clear a path for him to get through these crowds, okay? So this is the scene we have today in the gospel. And it's in this, as he went, the people pressed around him. And a woman who had had a flow of blood for 12 years, All right, so let's stop here. She had a flow of blood for 12 years. Why is this important? So here again, we have to understand the Old Testament background that they're living in. So the issue of blood in this time, and according to the Old Testament, blood was a very powerful thing, probably the most powerful thing there was. Blood, it was very symbolic. So blood was the sacrifice of the animals that took place in the temple. It was from their blood that the priests would take that blood and clean the horns of the altar with it. And this symbolized the cleansing of the sins of the people of Israel. This was what the sin offerings did. The blood cleansed the sins of the people. So blood was this cleansing agent. It was a very powerful thing. But at the same time, because it was so powerful, it could also have a negative effect when it was used improperly. So when blood was outside of its context, it could defile. So it tells us many places in the Old Testament, especially Leviticus, that this blood was defiling, and that if someone had contact with blood, that they couldn't enter into the temple to make their sacrifice. They would have, but this is not, a lot of times, we tend to read these Old Testament passages in our own context of being a moral issue. When they say that this person was unclean or defiled, that it was somehow a moral issue. It wasn't a moral issue at all. It was simply, these were the commands of God. God had said that if you had contact with blood, you were unclean. And then 7 days after contact with blood was finished, you would have to take a ritual bath. And then you would offer a sacrifice in the temple, and you would be clean again, and you could participate in the services of the temple. It was a simple formula. It's just something you did because blood had this effect. It had nothing to do with whether you are a good person or not. This is simply what one did. So this woman, though, who has an issue of blood for 12 years, there are many theories about what her condition might have been. But the point of the story is that she was ritually unclean. And that it wasn't just an issue where we come in contact with blood or we cut ourselves or something, and then after 7 days, you go through the ritual bath, you offer the sacrifice, and you're clean again. This woman had a continual flow of blood for 12 years, so she could never become clean. So for 12 years, she was ostracized. Not only was she unclean, but anyone who had contact with her would become unclean as well. So this holiness and the opposite, this uncleanness, was contagious in the Old Testament. And again, it has nothing to do with morality. This was simply what God had commanded in Leviticus, and the people obeyed. This was one of the ways that God was calling the people out from the rest of the world, making them different and making them holy. But this is this woman's problem. For 12 years, she can't touch anybody. And furthermore, it says, and had spent all her living upon physicians and could not be healed by anyone. So actually, scholars think that in the original version of Luke, this line actually was probably missing, that it was only in Mark, that Luke had not mentioned this detail because according to our tradition, Luke was a physician. So he probably left out the detail that she had spent all her money on physicians and they hadn't done any good. But in the manuscript we're using today, it has the line in there. So she had spent all her money. Mark, anyway, tells us this for certain, which tells us that she was probably a woman of means because at that time, only someone who had means could afford to go to a physician. So she's a woman of means, but she's ostracized from society. And furthermore now, she's impoverished financially because she's used all her money on doctors who have not been able to do anything for her. She could not be healed by anyone. So she came up behind him, the text says, and touched the fringe of his garment. Has anyone ever seen, when we make the great entrance, sometimes you'll see people, they'll bow down and they'll touch the fringe, the edge, the hem of the garment of the priest. This is a kind of symbolic action. It's a pious folk custom that's existed for many, many centuries probably. It's an imitation of this woman. Seeing the priest as the icon of Christ, they see themselves as this woman, and they want to touch the garment. They want to touch the garment to be healed. It's a beautiful tradition. But actually, So it's the fringe of the garment. And again, this is another Old Testament allusion. This one goes from Numbers. So I don't know if you've ever seen, even among modern Jews, they often have a prayer shawl. A pious Jew will have a prayer shawl, talit. And on it, there will be tassels on the corners of the prayer shawl, and there will be a little bit of blue in it. Well, from Numbers 15, it says, this is what God says to Moses. He says, "Speak to the people of Israel and bid them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations," forever, in other words, "and to put upon the tassel of each corner a cord of blue. And it shall be to you a tassel to look upon and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to go after wantonly. So you shall remember and do all my commandments, and be holy to your God." Be set apart. Another way that he's giving them something unique to do that's going to set them apart from the rest of the world. So it says here in Numbers, simply on the edge of their garment, on the corners of their garment, they would have this. But it became the tradition by Jesus' time that pious Jews would have a special garment that they would throw over their left shoulder, and then they, at times of prayer, they would put it over their head to pray. And it was on this garment that they would have these fringes. Now, today we have fringes on our priestly vestments, again, pointing back to the Old Testament tradition. So this is what Jesus was wearing at the time he's passing or trying to pass through this crowd. He's wearing this prayer shawl thrown over his left shoulder, and hanging down behind him, there are these tassels. And the woman comes up from behind him. Now, Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, a man of influence and prestige, he comes from the front. He approaches Jesus from the front. He bows down before him and asks a favor. This woman, however, dares not do that because it's known that she's unclean. No one wants to touch her because then they'll be unclean and they'll have to go through this process of waiting 7 days, taking a ritual bath, offering a sacrifice at the temple. So no one wants to know that she's near them. So she sneaks in through the crowd from behind while no one's looking. You can just picture her pushing through people from behind to get to Jesus. And she comes up from behind him, she bows down low, and she touches the tassel of his prayer shawl. Then what happens? It says, immediately her flow of blood ceased. Just by touching his garment, nothing else. He hasn't said any words. He hasn't taught. Nothing. Just by touching his garment, she's healed immediately. Even after 12 years and all her money spent on physicians who could do nothing, now she's healed immediately. And Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" When all denied it, Peter and those who were with him said, "Master, the multitudes surround you and press upon you." And then in Mark, it adds that Peter says, "And you say, 'Who touched me?'" I mean, this is a ridiculous thing that Jesus says, especially if you remember how much people are pressed all around one another. There's no idea of personal space. Everyone is touching everybody. So this is another cryptic statement that Jesus is making. Who was it that touched me? And Peter says, everyone's touching you, and you're asking who touched me? So is it that Jesus didn't know? Of course not. He's God. He knew who touched him, but he's doing this for a purpose. He's doing this for our edification, for the disciples' edification, for the multitude's edification. He wants now to point something out to us. So that means pay attention to what's coming next. But Jesus said in response to Peter's question, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone forth from me." Someone touched me. Now, everyone was touching him. Everyone around him was touching him. But what he's trying to say here, someone touched him in a special way. This is what he wants to point out to us next. Someone has touched him in a special way such that power has gone forth from him. Power. And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." So what are we to learn here by the fact that this woman touched Jesus? Now, everyone was touching Jesus. Was everyone healed? of their infirmities, their sicknesses? No. Jesus only felt power go out from him from the touch of one person who touched him in a special way. And the clue is given to us by the fact that when he calls her out, she comes how? She comes trembling before him. First, she had not dared to come from in front of him like Jairus. She approached furtively from behind because she didn't consider herself worthy to bother him. She approached in this way, and then when he called her out, she was trembling and falls down before him. So what does this tell us? It reminds me of the similar story in Matthew 15 of the Canaanite woman's faith, where the Canaanite woman came and knelt before Jesus. And remember, he keeps putting her off in this story of the Canaanite woman. He keeps putting her off. He ignores her at first, and then he tells her, we Jews, I came here for the people of Israel, not for the Canaanites. But she insists, and she says, Lord, help me. And he answered, it is not fair to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. This is how the Jews would typically talk about the Canaanites. And listen to her answer. She said, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Then he opens up. Then he says, oh, woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire. And her daughter was healed instantly. So there, I see a similarity in her approach, the Canaanite woman, and the woman with the issue of blood, whom we read about today. What's this similarity? It's this feeling of unworthiness. When we approach the Almighty God, that this feeling of he is up here and we are way down here. And it says even the St. John of Damascus captures it beautifully in this prayer, one of the many beautiful prayers that are offered to us by the church and the prayers before Holy Communion that we're encouraged to read before we come to Holy Communion in order to put us in the right state to approach God. Because now, here today, in a few minutes, we will be approaching not just to the touch of Jesus' garment, but we will approach to consume his whole body and blood, not just touching his garment. So what attitude should we have when we come and not just touch him, but consume him, take him inside of us? Jesus is trying to point out to us today in the gospel, this is how I want people to approach me. Like this woman who had a sense of her own unworthiness to approach Jesus. But what does Jesus do? When we humble ourselves, he exalts us. When we exalt ourselves, he humbles us. He wants us to approach in this humble way. Listen to St. John's words. I stand before the doors of your temple, and I have not refrained from wicked thoughts. But you, O Christ my God, justified the publican and showed mercy to the Canaanite woman that we read about, and opened the gates of paradise to the thief. Open for me the depth of your love, and receive me as I draw near and touch you, as did the harlot who cleansed his feet, and the woman with the issue of blood. The latter only touched the hem of your garment, and she immediately received healing, while the former, clinging to your pure feet, obtained forgiveness of her sins. But may I, the miserable one, be not consumed by daring to receive your whole body. Receive me as you did them, and enlighten the perception of my soul. This is how that we should be approaching Christ. When we come to Holy Communion, this is the attitude we want to cultivate within us. And all the things we do in the church, fasting, confession, all these things are good, but they're just means. They're not the thing itself. They're just means to an end. And what's the end? In order to cultivate within us this correct attitude that we want to have, that Christ is calling us to have before him, so that when we touch him, it's effective and power comes out. There were many other people touching Jesus, and he felt no power leave from him. None. They were not cured. They were not healed. Only she was healed when she touched him. We read, for example, in St. Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he's talking about, even in his time, he's talking about the power of the Holy Eucharist. And he tells the Corinthians in 11:27, whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of profaning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a man examine himself. This is why we have confession. Let a man examine himself, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body, without really understanding that this is Jesus Christ himself that we are consuming, eats and drinks judgment upon himself. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died from taking Holy Communion unworthily, from touching him unworthily. Many of you are weak and ill, and some have died from doing this. But if we judged ourselves truly, we should not be judged. So even here, he's reminding us, let's be like the woman with the issue of blood. Let's come from behind. Let's not think ourselves worthy. Let's not think of it as a right or an entitlement. But let's think of the majesty of God and his condescension to our lowly, sinful state, and try to cultivate this mentality that we say in another of the prayers before Holy Communion, make me worthy, although unworthy. So we don't beat ourselves up. We recognize what we really are, and then we ask God, because he did this for the woman with the issue of blood, because he did this for the harlot, do it also for me. Also make this touch effective so that power comes out from you and not just indifference. Amen.